Okay, back again. Third instalment for part three instalment for the written knowledge assessment. Part three, government and housing system quiz. So the first part requires a brief snapshot of the history of public housing in New South Wales. So I've got this slide here. Social housing, aka affordable or public housing, low-cost housing. So it was in New South Wales in the early 1900s. It was set up for low-income working families. So people working, they were employed, and the housing was typically set up around in close to those locations where that employment was being undertaken. So perhaps inner Sydney areas, there were low-income type labouring jobs there in the early 1900s, and people were, I guess, afforded social housing so that they were not having to pay too much. So in 1912 in New South Wales, the state government had a dedicated housing agency. So I guess that's the forerunner to our Department of Housing. After 1945, it's saying social housing really became embedded in the landscape of towns and cities, and I guess the town I grew up, 60s and 70s, not too far from here, but certainly there was an established part of the town where there were Housing Commission back then, or Department of Housing stock housing that's still there now. A few of them have been upgraded and modified, but yeah, there's a proportion of that township. I guess what I'd say, I'm not sure, I mean the town has grown, I don't know if the number of Department of Housing or low affordable housing stock has grown. So that takes us into the 80s, and then there was a bit of a turning point against public housing in popular opinion. Perhaps that's saying here a reduction in the size of public housing and not building as much perhaps from the 80s on. And that's probably what I just said, not seeing as much growth in it in some way, shape or form, because it became a little bit of perhaps a political hot potato. But I guess what we would say from that period on, the focus has shifted onto people from low income families, people who are marginalised, unemployed, having a disability perhaps, or something that excluded them from full participation in the labour market, or if they were in the labour market, it was low income jobs. So having said that, if we take a look at the questions, so part three, government and housing system quiz. So who were the beneficiaries of social housing when it was first introduced in Australia? So moderate income earners in housing developments near employment. So B, that was a target aim. So people who were working, perhaps in factories, as I said, but they were moderate to low income jobs. Next, number two, how has the allocation of social housing changed over time? So prioritising working families. Okay, that's A, it's not that one. Prioritising very low income earners unable to meet their housing need in any other way. Or C, prioritising families with more than one child, or prioritising those as essential worker roles. So it's B, very low income earners. So that's, and yeah, as I said, marginalised in some way, which contributes to being a low income earner. So now let's go to levels of government. Think of three levels of government and which impact on social housing, funding and policy, and match the government type to the definition of the role in the social housing market. So just briefly, we've got our local government, our local council if you like. They're often looking at your roads and rates and rubbish. I guess they do have a foot in setting up designs and making sure neighbourhoods are designed well, particularly new estates, and making sure there's infrastructure and contributions from developers to put in essential services, whether it be childcare, schools perhaps in a larger area, footpaths, community services, that sort of thing. Then we've got our state government. They're, I guess, a big player in that social housing stock. Our funding of our Department of Housing, and they're managing that, as well as also working closely with our social housing providers, non-government providers, Hume, Compass, for example. And then we've got at the top, our federal or national Commonwealth government, sometimes it's called. So often they're a funding allocator, to the states to help support their programs and approaches to dealing with homelessness. So let's just have a look. So we've got the description, provides social and crisis housing funding to the states and the territories. So that's the role of the federal government. So allocates funding to state-run housing, for example, the Department of Communities and Justice, and not-for-profit community housing providers. So the not-for-profit community housing providers are the ones I mentioned, like Hume or Compass. So that's the state government, and manages funding for neighbourhood support schemes or smaller affordable housing programs. So that's your local government. So they got their toe in the water where they can, the local government, but they're probably hamstrung in terms of available funds, but they're trying.
So I'm just going to play a little radio segment from ABC Radio that was played this morning on the 7:30 a.m. ABC local radio news in Newcastle, and it talks about the relationship between the different levels of government in that housing provision space, as it is a very critical and current issue. And I guess what I would say from this little segment, there are moves to increase the relationship and the funding relationship in particular, and what the local government can do in the Newcastle area in terms of providing that social housing and meeting that shortfall in meeting the demand. So I'll just hand it over to ABC Radio now.
Morning, Ben Millington with ABC Hunter News. The Deputy Premier has forecast calling on the federal government to help resolve the regional housing crisis in the state. The Regional Housing Task Force recently found a state planning-led response directed at supply alone was unlikely to solve affordability issues. In a budget estimates hearing, Minister Paul Toole said the government would need to find short and long-term solutions.
What I'm going to commit to is talking to various ministers about various matters that could be addressed in this holistic solution. And also at a Commonwealth level as well, there is a part that I believe the Commonwealth can play as well.
Meanwhile, the Lord Mayor of Newcastle has praised the state government's housing minister, Melinda Pavey, for setting up a memorandum of understanding with council to improve and build social housing. The 3-year agreement will see the council invest around $6 million, a figure equal to what the state government pays the council in rates on its social housing properties. 59 properties are expected to be delivered in the next 2 years, but there are nearly 1,200 households on the wait list in Newcastle, with 98 listed as urgent. Councillor Nuatali Nelm says under the first of its kind agreement, council will have direct input into the social housing process.
It's likely to be an exemplar in terms of how we actually ensure there is new, social and affordable housing right throughout New South Wales. Not only should the stock be improved, but also brand new stock.
Part 4, there are different types of housing assistance funded by government to meet different housing needs. Match the housing program type to the definition. So I've got a few slides. Let's just have a look what I've got. We've got the crisis housing funded model, so that's that short-term gap measure. Could even be a low-cost motel or caravan park, women's or youth refuge, for example. That crisis approach, the transitional approach to housing, longer-term history being used to help those leaving institutions, perhaps leaving hospitals, to get their transition back to the private rental market. But it's seen as temporary and a stepping stone to public housing or private rental. So perhaps people with a disability, maybe people leaving incarceration could fit into this one, and certainly perhaps in that mental health space. They're the ones that come to mind. Community housing model, affordable long-term housing for people on low incomes, so places like Compass or Hume, and a pathway then from there to perhaps private or public housing. Public housing, affordable long-term housing delivered by the state authority, Department of Housing, long-term. Perhaps a pathway to private rental or home ownership. So let's just have a look at the word bank. So we've got the short-term intermediate assistance with and without social support in shared settings such as refuges. So that's that crisis and transitional. Housing for persons on low income unable to meet their housing needs in the private rental, so that's social. So this next one, I'm not got a definition of that, but young people exiting care who are homeless, who live on site in independent units and engage in education, training or work. So this is FOIA. So this is a relatively new category. I'm aware of its existence. So the Samaritans run a I guess, semi-independent, semi-supported units at Wickham. It's an older building that's converted for that purpose, but the young people engage in education, training or work, and they live on site. They're independent, but they do get some sort of checking in and support, so that's being called FOIA. So that's a new definition. Housing at 30% below market rent for persons who are employed and on low to moderate income. So we're talking affordable housing there. Okay, a street to home model where people are housed in independent units in a purpose-built facility or the private market with wraparound support. So this definition is we're going housing first. And this is again relatively new, but I've become a little bit more familiar with in recent times, where that's purpose-built or allocated housing, independent, purpose-built, and they've got wraparound support. So people are, I guess, really breaking cycles of disadvantage by being provided this housing model. It was first I heard about it maybe a year or two ago up in a place in Queensland. I'm sure it was very successful and it's probably spreading. But that's being considered housing first as a definition. Housing choices modified to suit requirements and funded under the NDIS. So we're going disability, the NDIS, that's disability focused. A legal agreement to occupy a residential premises with rent and tenure are governed by the Residential Tenancy Act and managed by landlords, so that's private rental. A rental subsidy is paid between the private market amount and the part the tenant paid can be linked to support, for example, Start Safe. So that's the private rental subsidy, that one. Number 5, very low income earners live in rooming or boarding houses with shared facilities. Are boarding houses considered suitable for longer term needs is a question. Choose true or false for some of the issues for boarding houses which form part of the safety net of the private rental market. So think about the boarding houses. So there's a good example in the Filthy Rich and Homeless of a boarding house. One in Sydney was pretty dingy and scary, and I think a younger woman found it too overwhelming to stay. And then there was an example of a similar one up in Adamstown, run in Newcastle by Adam Bowman, a bit of a prominent person in the community, and he's sort of made his mark in this boarding house scene, and people use it to meet this need. But shared bathroom and kitchen facilities may create problems with health and sanitation. That's true, you can imagine that. Imagine COVID times as well, sharing communal bathrooms and toilets. Rooming houses can be an affordable, safe alternative to longer term social housing. So affordable, safe, and the answer's false there. Probably the safe is the one that rears its head. Lack of privacy in addition to large houses for people with complex needs can lead to safety incidents. Now that's true. So if you've got complex needs and you've got lack of privacy, that can lead to incidents around safety. That's true. Time in a boarding house counts as evidence of a successful residency tenancy in the private rental market. The answer is that it's false. So that's unfortunate. So if you're paying rent, and even though it's a boarding house, apparently that's not considered good enough to take a rental track record into the private market. Okay, so I'm just going to have a look at question 6. Community housing providers deliver social housing within Australia. Which instrument measures the quality of service, and how is the provider's performance regulated? Choose 2 responses to demonstrate your knowledge. So it's the National Community Housing Standards and Service Indicators monitor delivery. And D, under the National Regulatory Community Housing System, NRCHS, providers must be registered and provide evidence of activities that meet the regulatory standards. So A, National Community Housing Standards and Service Indicators, they monitor the standard of delivery, and providers must be registered under that National Regulatory Community Housing System, NRCHS, and they provide evidence of what they've been doing to meet the standards. So standards like I guess, providing adequate repairs and maintenance and I guess the standard of living, I guess standard of housing provided, and any other perhaps wraparound supports that are required. Okay, in addition, so question 7, in addition to community and affordable housing, there are a range of 10 euro types, lengths and providers available. Choose true or false to demonstrate your knowledge. In New South Wales, public housing offers tenure for life. Apparently that's false. B, crisis housing tenure time is often up to 12 weeks, so 3 months, while transitional can be 12 to 18 months, so that's true. Housing cooperatives, which I did mention earlier. So housing cooperatives are a form of lower cost housing which leads to own ownership, so that's false apparently. I guess it's about lower cost and sharing costs and a way of living collectively to try and navigate the expenses of living, but apparently it's not seen as a pathway to home ownership specifically. Housing associations may offer culturally tailored and culturally specific housing support and tenure, so that's true. I'll have to have a look at housing associations in a little bit more detail. I'm not familiar with them around this area. It sounds like something I've heard of, perhaps in Melbourne, but I will do a little research and find out. But anyway, that was true, and that takes us to the end of part 3, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Toodles.